Okay, this is the first part of the lecture for Chapter 4, which is about coping with environmental variation, temperature, and water. So the first couple chapters we were developing some common language, understanding of the Earth system, variation within climate, and now we're going to start to look at how that impacts ecology in both plants and animals as our primary examples. The key concepts for this chapter is that each species has a range of environmental tolerances, and that determines its potential geographic distribution. The temperature of an organism is determined by exchanges of energy with the external environment, and the water balance of an organism is determined by exchanges of water and solutes with the external environment. This starts off with kind of a funny example of cryonetics, which is preserving of bodies, hoping that they can be brought back to life in the future. And then talking about these two frog species that can exist in a semi-frozen state with no breathing or without a heartbeat. It's pretty remarkable, and it's an example of how you can have this massive adaptation to environmental stressors, in this case temperature, within seemingly similar species. Here's a distribution of those two frogs, showing that they have an extreme northern exposure, and so this variation along latitude is related to this ability to withstand freezing. And when it comes to adaptations like this, we can think of it in two different ways. One is tolerance and two is avoidance. Meaning, if you have to deal with freezing temperatures, one way to deal with that is just leaving, avoiding those freezing temperatures, migrating like many animals do. And the other is developing tolerance. And that tolerance we'll look at kind of on a few different scales. But generally, we're talking about physiological ecology, the study of interactions between organisms and their environment, and how these interactions influence the survival and determines their geographical ranges. And so, at our foundation, environmental stressors is one of the big drivers of adaptation, which is the foundation of evolution. And so, at the core, what we're looking at is how organisms are adapting to these disparate environmental conditions, from tropics to freezing, and what do those adaptations look like, and how does that drive speciation or other variation within the ecological communities. And the physical environment influences an organism's ecological success in two ways. One is the availability of energy and resources, and extreme conditions can exceed tolerance limits. So you have to have energy, food, and energy, heat, and as well as, and I've mentioned this over and over again, and I'll probably keep mentioning it, that extremes are what's driving tolerance limits. So when we look at the actual geographic distribution of the species and relate to these other factors, the actual geographic distribution is typically smaller than the predicted geographic distribution. So you can think of this as, if we just look at mean climate data, an organism might be able to live at a certain latitude, but every 10 years there's a really bad winter. Well, that every 10 years is enough to prevent that species from taking hold in that area. It's these extreme conditions that are really driving that difference between theoretical range and realized range. So here's a kind of a graph of what that could look like, where, keep moving me around here, where you have the potential distribution. So based on whatever that environmental gradient might be, the examples given here are temperature, precipitation, and salinity. And then the actual distribution is usually smaller than that. And that's when other things come in to constrain that distribution, the difference between actual and potential. It can be extreme environmental events that happen every, like I said, 5-10 years. The other one is perhaps in this area in between the potential and the actual distribution. Yes, in theory, the animals can survive, but perhaps they're not as fit. Perhaps they're a little bit slower, they have a little less food resources, and that makes them more susceptible to predation or to disease or to other pests. And so we see, using the intertidal example, we see this a lot, which is, an organism can survive in a different part of the intertidal, but when they go there, they get eaten by something. And so there's a difference between potential distribution and actual distribution. And that's typically related to ecological interactions like that, like predation, or also these infrequent environmental disturbances, bad winters, etc. And again, reviewing last chapter, because plants don't move, they're good indicators of the physical environment. They're integrating change over a long period, where something like migratory waterfowl are typically not a good indicator of long-term environmental conditions because they fly. So that they're more of an indicator of what's happening right now versus an integrated signal over decades, in the case of trees, or centuries, in fact, right? So the aspen distribution can be predicted based on climate. Limiting factors include low temperature and drought. So there's a climate envelope, a range of conditions over which the species occurs, and we can predict the response to climate change based on that. So here's an example of the climate and the aspen distribution, showing their predicted distribution and their actual distribution, with the predicted distribution being larger than the actual distribution. And then this further breaks it down to what are those limiting factors. Fruit ripening, is there enough sunny days for this to happen? Or flowers surviving a frost. So if the tree flowers in the spring and it flowers before the last frost, then those flowers will be frozen and die, as well as just general survival, water, things like that. So we could look at climate variation or climate signals and have a predicted distribution, but the actual distribution is typically a bit smaller. And so we can look at the physiological processes that have optimal conditions for functioning, and deviations from optimum reduce the rate of the process. This is just saying that there's a certain temperature and suite of conditions, temperature, rain, oxygen levels, that enzymes and other physiological processes are optimally suited for. And as we move out of that range, warmer, colder, drier, wetter, results in decreased rates of these physiological processes, lowering the potential for survival, growth, and reproduction. An example of that is at high latitudes, there's low amounts of oxygen. So that could be a limiting factor for the distribution of animals, where otherwise things might be okay. They could deal with the cold, but the lack of oxygen for a large animal is a big concern. And so similarly to the kind of bell curve of optimal conditions, we can think about that in the rate of physiological processes, where we can have temperature along the x-axis and the rate of the physiological process along the y. And what's interesting here is that there's usually a pretty strong tipping point, where if we're a little too cold, 10 degrees too cold, it's okay. But if we get 10 degrees too warm, it's much more severe. And so typically there's a the threshold at the top is a bit higher. When we think about temperature, overheating, or if we're thinking about fish, maybe salinity, maybe that they're fine with a salinity of 5, and they're fine with salinity below that, 3, 2, 1. But when we get up to salinity of 7, it's a big issue. When we get to salinity of 10, the organism dies. So often these thresholds can be precipitous. Turning point is another way of thinking about it. A tipping point, rather. Tipping point. We use tipping point. Both Malcolm Gladwell uses tipping point, but also in thinking about resilience of ecosystems, tipping point is a word we often use. So you could have this idea of an optimum, and then above that optimum, it's a tipping point. And acclimatization is the adjusting to stress through behavior or physiology. This is a short-term reversible process. Mountain climbers get acclimatized at a base camp to get used to living in a low oxygen environment. People from, when I lived in Southern California and I moved back to Washington, I was cold all the time. I was used to never having to wear a coat, never having to wear pants, always wearing flip-flops. And so coming back, you have to get reacclimatized to your area. But these are short-term, individual level responses. They can be the foundation for long-term evolutionary changes, but that will require some selection based on that altered fitness. So over time, natural selection can result in adaptation of a population to environmental stress. And so in this way, you can think of individuals that acclimatize well to that environment would have to have some increased success. And success here is defined as offspring. So individuals that have a genetic variation that allows them to acclimatize better to, say, higher elevations are going to have more offspring, which are going to carry those genes and go on and have more offspring. And that's eventually leading to adaptation, which is a long-term genetic response of the population. Over long time periods, it could lead to speciation. Typically, it leads to subspeciation. And so we can think about this along this timeline where we can have stress and individuals acclimatize to that, and then over generations and over evolutionary time, they can increase their rate of physiological processes. So they can create adaptations to dealing with, say, cold, thicker fur, more blubber, etc. And I want to talk quickly about ecotypes. I don't really like the example in the book, so I'm going to use a different one. These are marine snails. This is Littorina. Littorina is here in the Northwest as well. If you go down to the beach and you see a bunch of little tiny black snails at the very upper end of the tide line, those are Littorina. Those are actually Littorina. I think of it because they kind of litter the intertidal. so I think it's easy to remember Littorina. But this is an example in Europe of different ecotypes, and the same thing is true with some of our snails, and there's some good examples on the East Coast. But snails that live in crab areas, what they're calling S ecotype, are crab resistant, so they have thicker shells, and then snails that live in hard rock exposed areas form what they call the E ecotype, which are smaller and they're able to stick to the rock better. This next image will show it a bit more. So this is the same species. The individuals that live on boulders are bigger with thicker shells, and in between these boulders, or within these boulders, you can have crabs that come out at high tide and try to eat these guys. And so they bulk up a whole bunch. You have bigger snails, the thicker shells, and then you can have the E ecotype, which live on these big flat rock walls where crabs typically don't crawl up and predate on them. But here the primary source of stress is being hit by waves. And so they're dealing with a much greater wave energy. And so to accommodate for that, They're smaller and lighter, so the waves are less likely to blow them off. And then we have a hybrid type in between those. So this is one example of ecotypes that can occur on a relatively small scale. These can be kind of bay to bay, sort of kilometer to kilometer. In this case, you can see the scale bar here is on the meter scale. And so it's not even, Washington versus Oregon. It's North Bellingham Bay versus South Bellingham Bay, or, Fairhaven versus Chuckanut, even kind of a smaller scale than that. So it's pretty interesting to see how quickly these organisms can adapt and develop these different ecotypes. And then the in between, the S and E ecotype are these hybrids, which are kind of halfway in between.